On behalf of the Center for a New American Security, welcome to today's event, Containing Crisis, Strategic Concepts for Coercive Economic Statecraft on China. My name is Emily Kilcrease. I'm the Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program here at CNAS. The Center for a New American Security is a nonprofit, bipartisan organization dedicated to developing strong, pragmatic, and principled national security solutions. The Energy, Economics, and Security Program explores the dynamics of the global economy and its implications for U.S. national security, foreign policy, and economic statecraft. We've had a long-standing research interest in coercive economic statecraft dynamics, particularly between the United States and China. So today's conversation is very timely and one of a long-standing interest to us. We're reading new reports daily about China's economic coercion against Lithuania. In the wake of the passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the United States, we're seeing China put pressure on Western multinational companies operating in China, and we may see more instances of retaliation to China's economic coercion in response to the diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. In the second half of today's event, we'll dive into a recent CNAS report that explores these dynamics and develops overarching strategic concepts for the United States and its allies and partners to effectively respond to China's economic coercion in times of geopolitical crisis. But before we get to that, I'm delighted to welcome Representative Ami Bera. Representative Bera has represented California's 7th Congressional District in the House of U.S. Representatives since 2013. He's currently a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he serves as chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Nonproliferation, and is a senior member of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. And very relevant to today's discussion, Representative Bera is the co-sponsor, along with Representative Ann Wagner of Missouri, a proposed bipartisan legislation intended to address these issues of economic coercion with China. So Representative Bera, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to CNAS.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks for having me on. And we really appreciate the work that CNAS is doing on this really important topic. I mean, when we think about it, you touched on in real time, we're watching the economic coercion and what China's doing against Lithuania, but they've got a long history. You can look back at what they've done with Australia over, Australia's questions about viral origins and so forth. And we really think this is obviously a very timely topic. So looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you so much. And before we dive in, I will just note for our viewers that the audience is welcome to submit questions. They can do so by going to cnas.org/live or by sending us a tweet at #CNAS2022. We'll sprinkle those in as we go. But to kick us off, Representative Bera, we're very interested in the legislation that you've introduced to try to get at that issue. Could you tell us a little bit about what that legislation is trying to do, why you decided it was a priority for you at this time, given everything else that Congress has to deal with these days? Why this issue? Why now? And what's next for the legislation?
Yeah, it's extremely important that the United States and the administration, whether it's a Democratic or a Republican administration, understands how China uses economic coercion. We've talked about, very obvious ways they're doing it, but there's probably very subtle ways that they use economic coercion as well. So what we've asked as an administration over a 3-year period, really do a deep dive and study how China uses their coercive tools, but then also come up with the best practices for how we should respond. And backstage, we were chatting a little bit about the response to Lithuania, and I think it has come together fairly quickly where you've seen across the interagency process, state, USTR, and others coming together with our European allies. But let's actually think through the various scenarios and work through it. So we've got multiple tools in our toolbox, and that's really what we're asking, to understand it, to set up an interagency task force that's run through the NSC, and then better understand what tools we should have to counter that coercion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the tools question is an important one, right? I mean, we've all seen a bunch of tariffs for better or worse over the last couple of years. Is that the kind of thing that the government should be thinking about? Is it more direct assistance? Is it political statements? At some point we'll have to get down to those brass tacks. What's your sense of kind of what's effective here and what might be counterproductive in some of these instances?
It's probably all of the above, and it probably depends on what the Chinese actions are. And in this case, you've seen Taiwan step up and offer $200 million of investment to Lithuania. And that's probably appropriate. It's probably appropriate for the Europeans and the United States to think about how we can minimize the impact of China. But in other cases, I think the heavy-handed approach that China sometimes takes actually is doing our work for us. I mean, I would have said 3-4 years ago that Australia was taking a somewhat laissez-faire attitude towards China. That's not the case today. They're probably one of our strongest allies in understanding how to counter what China's doing around the world, and certainly in the Indo-Pacific.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so where do you see this legislation heading? Clearly, Congress has a strong interest in doing something on China these days. We're following USICA. We're following kind of the range of bills that have been introduced. Obviously, there's parts of the NDAA that address China issues. Kind of how do you see this fitting into that broader effort underway legislatively right now to try to really kind of rebalance the economic playing field, make sure that we do have all of the right tools and authorities across the board to really rise to the China challenge?
Well, I think that with regards to China, as we come back into session, I think you will see a lot of movement in a conference committee set up to get USICA, the EAGLE Act, merge those two bills together and get that across the finish line. We're hoping that we can get our economic coercion bill to committee to markup, non-controversial, bipartisan. So we think again, there shouldn't be any issue whether we're able to move it as a standalone bill or just attach it to something else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So one issue that's quite difficult when we're thinking about economic coercion is the role of the private sector. Obviously, it can be quite difficult for individual firms to try to take a stand on issues, right? Because then they'll just be directly in the crosshairs. We've seen that multiple times, most recently with H&M, dealing with the cotton issues. We've seen it with Nike. At the same time, we often criticize our companies if they're not doing kind of what we would like them to do as a government, but it's still legal to do. So how do we get the private sector on board with some of the momentum here to try to address this issue, recognizing that there is going to be a significant commercial interest in China for the foreseeable future? There's a market there. Those are all sorts of really complicated dynamics. How do we convince the private sector and provide the right kind of incentives for them to really kind of get on board with addressing this issue head on?
That's always complicated. It's always better on the front end to make sure you're having that open dialogue and there's a recognition and an understanding of why you may be passing certain legislation. Obviously, the Uyghur forced labor bill probably did cause some anxiety within the private sector as we move that forward. How we implement it, how we enforce some of that, the devil's in the details. And that said, though, we have a certain set of values, as democratic countries that think about human rights, think about the rule of law, and fair practices and economic practices. So I think the best way to approach this is to have that dialogue on the front end, so industry understands why we as the government may be thinking about certain pieces of legislation, and then they can hopefully help influence how we implement it.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on kind of the values issue and the rule of law approach that we take. That is really important to tease out because, one question we often get is, well, the U.S. uses coercion too, right? We've got sanctions, we've got export controls, we've got all sorts of stuff. But clearly there's something different about what China's doing, right? It's not based in rule of law. They use off-book measures that are kind of hard to attribute, very similar to kind of gray zone tactics. How do we differentiate between what we're doing and what they're doing, and why what they're doing is worse than what we're doing?
So what they're doing really is direct coercion. I would hope that we would try to use diplomatic tools. And when I think about our use of sanctions and so forth, they're usually used as temporary measures to get folks to the table to achieve some other good. You can think about sanctions on Iran around the nuclear deal. The role of the sanctions weren't to punish the people of Iran. It was to force the government of Iran to come to the table to engage in a dialogue. And I think that's how we've preferred to use sanctions. I don't think they're the preferred first tool. Let's take Korea as an example, though. When we deployed our THAAD batteries in Korea, the height of tensions between North Korea and South Korea, for the purpose of defense of our Korean allies, as well as our assets that are in South Korea, that had nothing to do with China. That had to do with our defense there. What China did in retaliation, cutting off the flows of tourists and so forth going into Korea, had real economic harm that continues to this day in Korea. That's not the use of sanctions. That's saying, hey, you can't do this. And this had nothing to do with China. It had to do with protecting our allies in Korea and our assets in Korea.
Yeah, absolutely. And the question of Korea and we've talked about Lithuania. There's this bigger question about how do we work with allies, right? I mean, so we want to bring as many friends to the fight as we can, right? If we're trying to push back on this stuff. It's historically been difficult to do that, frankly, just because there are different economic interests. There's has been, I think this is changing, but there has been a different kind of perception of the strategic threat presented by China. But clearly, this is an area where we need to get those allies on board. There's been some progress to do that, I think, through the Biden administration's priorities and its emphasis on partners and allies. But kind of what's your sense of the work remaining there to really kind of build that consensus of liberal democracies or countries who are concerned about coercion to really address this issue?
Yeah, so China's doing some of the work for us, right? They're bringing us much closer to the Europeans and the EU. I do think some of the actions that the EU's taken recently are not ones that I would have expected a year or two ago. Let's think about what I thought was the Chinese overreaction to relatively minor sanctions, in Xinjiang on the Uyghurs. Their overreaction and singling out some European EU parliamentarians really drove a wedge between what I thought was not a great trade deal or economic investment deal, and that died. Fast forward to where the Europeans are today, where we're certainly having dialogue with our counterparts on how we can address this issue of economic coercion, but multiple other issues. Same thing with the Canadians. And so I think we have to be open to that dialogue. There are going to be areas where you're watching what some of the EU is doing right now. There'll be areas where we disagree, and they may have different tools, and we may have different tools. But I think right now we're on the same page with the Europeans, with the Australians, even the Indians, who tend to be non-allied. Some of the Chinese aggression, and that may not be economic coercion, but the aggression on the northern border certainly is pushing the Indians to take a second look and think about the heavy-handed approach of China in that region.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we've seen the administration try to address some of these issues in the various configurations that they've been setting up with allies. So we've got the Quad, which includes India. You've got the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which has some pretty ambitious commitments related to export controls. We've got an Indo-Pacific economic framework that's kind of still TBD in terms of its content and its form. Is this kind of the right way to go about addressing the coercion issue? Are there other kind of configurations or institutions we should be thinking about at this point?
Yeah, I think it is. I think while the details are still not out there, but programs like the Build Back Better World, what does that look like? And I think we also have to understand, economic coercion isn't just retaliation. If you think about the port in Sri Lanka, some of that is the financing mechanisms of some of these big projects that are counter to the interest of that particular country. So I understand why countries in the region and around the world sometimes look to China for that investment and aid, because we may not be there. I think we as like-minded, like-valued allies, developed nations, should come together and figure out how we can leverage our resources as well to do investment. Because coercion isn't just the retaliation. It can also be coercion on the front end based on the terms of financing.
Yeah, and I think what you're highlighting here, and I know this is an area that you followed, is the U.S. really needs to be engaged on a positive basis as well, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. So we're all very closely watching this Indo-Pacific economic framework. There's some of us who perhaps wish that CPTPP or a digital trade agreement was on the table. Kind of what's your sense of how we need to be articulating kind of the values and the benefits of engaging in the region? Why is that good for the U.S.? Why is that good for the region? How do we actually go about doing that?
Yeah, the countries in the region very much want the United States to be engaged. And I agree with you. I wish I had a magic wand and we could go back to 2015 and get TPP across the finish line. That may be a road too far, but the next hearing that I'll chair in our subcommittee is going to be on the importance of a digital trade deal in the Indo-Pacific and why we ought to be thinking about that. And the countries in the region certainly want it. I do think that's an area where we would hope the administration is willing to start engaging in dialogue. And I'm optimistic. And we have things that we can build on when we talk about digital trade. You've got the digital trade chapter out of USMCA. That passed broadly with the bipartisan support. You've got bilateral executive agreements with Japan. So there's places where we can start that already exist. And I think that is when you talk about positive economic engagement. I think that's the positive economic engagement that we can use as a tool to counter some of the negative things that China is doing.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We've gotten a question from the audience, which I'll read out now from Anthony. What do you think would happen if the U.S. modified the Taiwan Relations Act to include automatically imposing punitive tariffs if China took coercive economic action against Taiwan?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
So, the challenge with the straits right now and just the tensions between Taiwan and China is not an easy one. So what I would say is we should have some clarity in terms of the deterrent tools that are available. And some of those tools are economic deterrent tools. Part of a bill that we introduced, the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act, really talked about how we can increase our economic engagement with Taiwan, as well as how we can get others around the world to increase their economic engagement with Taiwan. So I don't think we're waiting for the Chinese to retaliate against Taiwan. I think we're signaling the desire to maintain the status quo, which has been prosperous for both China and Taiwan. But we do want to increase our our economic engagement with Taiwan, and I think that's what you're seeing around the world with Europeans and others.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Let me ask you about the role of the WTO in all of this. Obviously there are rules that we've agreed to, that China's agreed to, that discipline some of this behavior. Kind of what's your sense of how effective the WTO can be in trying to rein in some of the economic coercion that we're seeing?
The WTO has not been super effective. Obviously, we've seen China flout some of the rules and the regulatory framework within the WTO. That said, that is an international organization that we have. We've got to be engaged. Can we make necessary reforms to really create the framework so there are disincentives to this type of economic coercion?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And at some point, you've got to have dispute settlement and that whole range of stuff to make that actually bite. Absolutely. That's a bigger problem than we're going to solve today in today's panel, I think. But another question from the audience, from Kevin. What do you assess to be the most effective U.S. or global response to Chinese activities in the South China Sea? And what do you think their strategic objectives are? Yeah,
so the South China Sea is going to be much harder to solve today than it would have been back in 2013, 2014, because China's already developed a foothold there. They've already put assets on these islands. And now you see the gray zone tactics that they're using, against the Filipino fishermen, but also around Vietnam, all the way down to the tunas in Indonesia and so forth. I think our best strategy is to continue to engage the countries in Southeast Asia, continue to work with them. Obviously, we're doing Navy rotations and through those that area, and we've got to maintain a strong U.S. presence. But deals like the AUKUS deal and so forth, I think, also signal to China that we want to keep the South China Sea as one of the most important waterways of commerce. You've got to have freedom of navigation there. There's got to be a rule of law there. Yeah, I would also hope, and I've talked to my colleague Joe Courtney, who's on the House Armed Services, that we ought to see if there's a way for us to ratify UNCLOS as well. Because I also think, if the United States were to ratify UNCLOS, that would also give us one more tool to try to put some pressure on China and what they're doing in the South China Sea.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think is there space to try to negotiate directly with China on any of this? I mean, obviously that's a big debate right now in the trade policy circles about whether there's any utility in trying to proceed with a phase 2. Some of these issues you can kind of get at indirectly through working with allies, but is there a direct path, or is that just completely naive to think that, there's a solution that could be negotiated at the table between the two countries at this point?
I mean, at this moment in time, it seems like the relationship and the dialogue has really broken down and it's going in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. But your point's well taken. Ultimately, you have to be able to sit down and put things on the table and find resolutions. This is not, we're going to be competitive with China in the 21st century. That's a given. Competition's not a bad thing. Can we have competition without direct confrontation? And we don't have to guess the direction that Xi Jinping wants to take China, because he's said that in his public statement. So we know where he is headed. Can we influence that, or can we open lines of dialogue? The countries in the region don't want to be caught between the United States and China. They're obviously going to have relations with both of us, and I think that's fine. That said, right now, I don't think the prospects of dialogue are all that great, but the hope would be we've got to establish those lines of communication. I think that is what the president is certainly trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. We've heard that language from both sides, actually, from leaders on both sides about competition without conflict, and hopefully we can get to that steady state, right? Looking ahead, I know a lot of folks are looking at the Olympics to see how Beijing's going to handle that. There's obviously the diplomatic boycott from the U.S. and other countries. So you can easily see some of these issues coming to a head again. What should we be looking for around the Olympics? What do you think Beijing's going to do? What's the U.S. response on some of these issues?
I think there'll be some saber rattling coming out of Beijing, statements and so forth. But at the end of the day, maybe Omicron is what diffuses a lot of these tensions, since we're, certainly, China's zero COVID policy. I'm not sure how you implement that when you have athletes coming into your country from all around the world in the midst of this Omicron surge. So, I think you'll see statements and saber rattling, but I think they're going to have their hands full just trying to pull off these Olympics.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah, it's a big task right now, for sure. So let's see, from Annie in the audience, could you talk about the anti-coercion instrument that the European Union is working on, and whether it's compatible with the strategy you described for the United States?
Yeah, so I won't profess to be an expert on all the tools that the Europeans are putting together, but kind of at the top line level, I do think it's somewhat compatible. Some of those tools may actually backfire on us, and they may use them against the United States and so forth. But with the Europeans, we do have the ability to have dialogue, right? We have the ability to say, you see that around the steel tariff issue and so forth, where you see that around the Boeing issue, where having that dialogue, you're able to work through and resolve some of these issues. So, I don't think they're certainly not going in the wrong direction with this, but it does illustrate the importance of dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got time for one more question. And so just to wrap us up here, I'd welcome your thoughts on, when you go back to California and you talk to your constituents about this issue, is this resonating? Is it something that, everyday citizens care about? We spend so much time in DC about it, but, what's the case for kind of your constituents back home of why this matters, why we should pay any attention to it at all?
Well, so they don't care about it if I talk about it in terms of economic coercion. They do care about it when we talk about supply chains, when we talk about the fact that, if they want to go out and buy a new car, they're having issues with they don't know that it's the semiconductor issue that's slowing a lot of this down, but they know there aren't any cars on that lot, So when you talk about inflation, certainly supply chain. So while I don't think that's direct economic coercion, there's certainly the potential for economic coercion that would impact U.S. consumers. And I would talk about it in those issues. And I think that's why it's an important policy issue, because the Chinese, let's use rare earths as an example. I mean, there's a global reliance on China for access to rare earth elements that are hugely important to semiconductors, batteries, et cetera. If China created a choke point on that based on something we did, that would have direct impact on U.S. consumers. And I think that's why this is super important for us to think about.
Yeah, well, we certainly couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for being with us here today and sharing your insights. Best of luck with the legislation. Really appreciate you paying attention to this issue and to the digital trade issues and kind of the broader economic competition issues. Really appreciate you making the time to be here with us today, Representative Bera.
You're welcome. Be well.
Thank you. Take care. And now we'll move on to the second portion of our event today, where we'll talk about a report that CNAS launched in December entitled Containing Crisis. And I'd like to hand over the moderation reins to Rachel Ziemba, who is an adjunct senior fellow with CNAS's Energy Economics and Security Program, who will lead us through this portion. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks very much, Emily. And thanks to all of you for being here with us today. I'm Rachel Ziemba. I'm an adjunct senior fellow with the Energy Economics and Security Program at CNAS that Emily leads, where I work on coercive economic policies, which we're talking about today. I am one of the 3 co-authors of the report, which we launched last month, and which is available. We'll be talking about today, and I'll moderate. Looking forward to having a conversation with my co-authors, Emily Kilcrease, who you already know well, and Emily Jin, who is a research assistant in the program. We'll highlight some takeaways, but really try to be as specific as we can. Please continue to submit your questions. Some of those that the representative wasn't able to answer, we will address, obviously, from our perspectives. But we would welcome any of yours, whether sort of, technically about the report or sort of what's going on right now. I imagine we will be coming back to some of the issues we just talked about, or some of the specific cases, Lithuania, what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the South China Sea, all of these issues, and think about those from the headline examples. Before I get too far into all those examples, I just want to reiterate a few of the administrative points that Emily mentioned at the top. This conversation is public. It's being recorded. You know this. You're on our website right now. And the good news about that is that you can come back to it. You can tell your friends to watch this. And it'll be posted after the conclusion of the event. You can ask questions several different ways. You can tag CNAS 2022 on Twitter. You can put them in the chat box below this video on the CNAS website. But we won't take anonymous questions. So let us know who you are, because we also want to, we want to stay in touch with you both today and going forward. So ask us questions. That's how we make sure our research is as, sort of tailored as possible. I'll interject those questions where I can to my colleagues so that we keep things lively and make sure we're addressing your issues. And if you are having any technical issues, and I hope you're not this far into the event, please get in touch to our communications team, which is managing everything behind the scenes. They can be reached at comms@cnas.org. Let's get into the subject of this report and really talk about how we think some new sort of tools, new approaches can shape this relationship. The first thing I wanted to start with in this report is to dive a little more deeply into this idea of a strategic concept. Many people might be less familiar with that. It's definitely a term that those coming from defense and security are maybe much more familiar than economists like me. Explain to me, Emily Kilcrease, what's the utility of a strategic concept? Where does it fit in as we're thinking about how the U.S. can better manage its relationship with China?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. It's a great question. And it's a good one to start with. So generally just what is a strategic concept, right? So it encompasses a strategy or a set of ideas about how national power ought to be deployed. So it's very high level. It is very abstract, but the idea is that these are the kind of the visionary broad principles that you organize everything else around. So that's how you determine what your operational plan should be, your specific authorities, your tactics, et cetera. And so we thought it was important to start with strategic concepts, kind of given the state of US and ally thinking on these issues, really need to start with first principles and then go from there. And so that was the point of the report. There are other strategic concepts out there that folks in the defense field will be familiar with, if that's helpful to kind of further clarify what we're talking about. So, for example, NATO has a strategic concept of active engagement, modern defense, which guides its member states. Domestically, we've got DoD's integrated deterrence strategic concept. So it's that very high level kind of what is the overarching principles by which we should deploy national power. And so that's what we were trying to develop through our research and our report.
Great. Thanks a lot. Now, in other words, this is really a key way also to keep policies on track, to connect to strategy and to make sure that individual decisions, individual tools are aligned. Which is obviously something that's always a good goal. And we always write in reports like this, but I think this sort of, framing here, we'll get more into what these concepts are. Another thing that's unique about this report is the use of simulations, economic wargaming, we might call it. This is something, obviously has been a great part of being involved in CNAS over the years as we've done more work in that area. But as someone who's long worked on scenarios, especially for investors and the like, I think this was a key way of sort of fleshing out those scenarios. Emily, Jin, tell us a little bit more about why use some of the scenario exercises on a research method. How do these really translate to policy making? Why do you think this was such an effective exercise?
Thank you, Rachel. So our team, we designed these scenarios of economic escalation to best simulate a hypothetical high-stakes situation of US-China economic friction. So we focused on designing these scenarios so the primary stage of contention is in the economic domain, but we also describe the security and diplomatic developments surrounding the scenario as we recognize that this particular bilateral relationship gets entangled in conflict across many domains of foreign policy. And specifically, we designed two scenarios. The first one is based in the Indo-Pacific between the PRC and Taiwan. And the second one is based in Europe around a US government security review of a Chinese acquisition of sensitive, potentially dual-use technology. And this technology is originally designed by a European firm or developed by a European firm, but it has a majority US stake. So the way we ran these scenarios was intentionally free-form. So what we mean by that is we presented these scenario settings to our participants who formed into multiple country and regional teams. And this included the United States and the People's Republic of China, the teams. And we observed how the teams interacted with one another to manage the crisis or not manage the crisis. And the second part of your question, in which how our insights from these scenarios translate to relevance for government policy making, first of all, we ensure that our scenarios are designed as close to a real life crisis situation, but we also reminded the participants in the country or regional teams that while they have a really great range of policy tools available, they should try to focus on economic tools or policies while retaining the option to exercise diplomatic and political policies to supplement the primary economic policies. And we did this so we could see how each team's economic policies may interact with one another. And we made the bulk of our insights from just observing how these interactions went and further investigated these observations by conducting research interviews with experts. And as we all know, there is a growing consensus in the policy community that the United States and China are locked in a longer term geopolitical competitive dynamic. So figuring out how these two interact with one another as they lock heads in these geopolitical situations or episodes where economic coercion really is taking on center stage, and how the United States can respond to China is increasingly important.
Thanks. Going into detail, I want to hear a little bit more about the insights that are sort of pulled out by these, scenarios. Overall, I mean, this, my, sort of takeaway in summarizing it, one of the elements was the importance of building this whole exercise of doing scenarios also illustrated the importance of building up muscle memory among allies, among other, among even U.S. government actors, right? So thinking about how to respond, because it was interesting, and I'm maybe jumping the gun a little bit on some of your insights, but the takeaway of the kind of speed of different actors in responding and how they responded was an important, I thought, if unsurprising, sort of less surprising takeaway. What were the other insights? And I want to throw out an audience question in there, which I think is quite relevant to the insights. We've had a question from Donald who asks, do we foresee China increasing the use of coercive policy, specifically with export controls, to make it more difficult for US and EU companies? So maybe, thinking about that in the context of what were the insights from our simulations that might be relevant for export controls, particularly since we had, in a sense, an export control investment scenario as one of them. So Emily?
Absolutely. So the output of our scenario exercises, as Rachel mentioned here, were 5 insights, and those informed our 2 strategic concepts that we developed. I'll quickly list through the insights and attempt to answer the audience question. So our first insight is that China is maybe willing to deploy the widest range of economic tools in response to a geopolitical conflict. China's coercive economic toolkit is the broadest because it is able to deploy both official measures, so think of retaliatory tariffs, preferential loans, as well as more unofficial, or as we called it in the report, off-book measures. One example is targeted actions that really press on the bottom lines or specific entities, like boycotts encouraged through state propaganda. And our second insight is while both China and the United States may be willing to accept negative economic impacts to pursue their geopolitical objectives, both also demonstrate a preference to broadly retain access to each other's markets, which may constrain the use of the most extreme forms of economic coercion. So during these crisis situations of economic coercion, both China and the United States are generally willing to take on short-term costs to maintain their political objectives. But it was often in a way that's tit for tat and not overly or disproportional. And the trade war sort of illustrates this, with both sides largely proportional responses and their willingness to take on economic costs. And our third insight is that countries other than the United States may be more reticent to take coercive economic actions against China due to fears of possible negative economic and political consequences. So this, compared to our previous insight, where the US and China generally are willing to accept economic costs in the short term, third countries are less willing generally to do that. And our fourth insight is United States may be advantaged by its alliances, and its ability to act jointly with allies may compensate for the narrower set of economic tools that the United States is willing to use to manage geopolitical tensions. So this is compared to one of our previous insights, where we observed that China has a more expansive toolkit of coercive economic measures, including official and off-book measures. The United States has a more limited toolkit, but it could take advantage of its established relationships with partner nations to amass leverage. And our fifth and last insight is persuasive rather than coercive tactics may best improve the United States negotiating position when it seeks to use economic statecraft to manage geopolitical tensions. So when the United States leans on coercive tactics instead of persuasive ones to try to bring partner nations on board, it often has the opposite effect, or at least the immediate effect of pushing partner nations away. So in the context of the question, I just, I could address this, and I'm sure Emily Coercive has her thoughts on this as well. But in the context of the question and our insights, China does have the most expansive toolkit. So it's also generally not afraid to deploy official and unofficial measures. So just my quick gut response is yes, we could see an increased intensity or use of coercive policy and export controls. But I'll hand it over to Emily Coercive.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Absolutely. And I think there's a couple of important data points that we have for why that might be the case. I mean, one, I think they'll use any, sort of coercive economic measure if they think it's appropriate and effective in a particular circumstance. But two, more specifically, we saw the white paper recently on export controls coming from the Chinese government, which I think is a pretty important indicator that this is a tool that they see as valid. It's also pretty consistent with what we've seen in terms of China setting up comparable regimes to what the US or Western countries have in terms of setting up, sanctions or blocking statutes, setting up national security investment screening regimes. Even if those particular mimic regimes aren't used extensively, the fact that they're setting them up is, I think, an indication that someday they might be used if that seems appropriate. I'll also point out we've seen China use export controls in some particular cases. The TikTok case comes to mind when that was going through kind of the difficult regulatory process in the United States last year. At the same time, China was putting export controls on some of the underlying algorithms. So a pretty clear example that that's something that they do intend to use if the particular situation seems to warrant it.
Thank you. Emily Coercive, maybe you could elaborate, drawing from those insights, about the strategic concepts. What are they? The two in the report are joint pressure and bound engagement. What do those sort of short, snippets really mean? How far are we from actually achieving those concepts? Like, what would we need to do in order to actually put this more into practice?
Yeah, so we've got the two strategic concepts that were developed as a result of the research: joint pressure and bound engagement. And these are really intended to work in tandem. You can't really have one without the other. So joint pressure, I mean, this is pretty straightforward. It's simply the idea that the United States must work with allies and partners when developing effective responses to economic coercion. And the idea here is that the joint response is going to allow for maximal pressure. It'll strengthen the ability of the United States to really impose costs or mitigate damage, and make it harder for these coercive measures to actually have the effective impact that China wants them to have, right? So if you can blunt the impact, perhaps it makes it less attractive as an option moving forward. It's also, frankly, recognizing the fact that when you have an economy as large as China's, you don't really want to engage it one-on-one in a kind of peer competitor standing. You really want to bring a few more friends to the fight if you can, and have that combined economic heft and diplomatic power. And so that's the idea of joint pressure. How far are we from doing that today? I think we're seeing some important, promising signals from the Biden administration about wanting to work with allies. Obviously, you've got the work with the US EU Trade and Technology Council, which includes some work on investment screening and export controls. So that's an important effort. Clearly, on the sanctions front, they're trying to be very closely linked up with the EU in particular. And so I do think the rhetoric is there. They're trying to put some of those specific institutions and practices in place. There is more that can be done. In our report, we recommend that we actually do some joint, basically economic wargaming with our partners and allies, because we find that that's a really good way to kind of stress test some of these concepts. You don't want to get into a crisis and then realize that you don't have the same legal authorities to take an action that you think is effective. It's much better to figure that out ahead of time and really kind of stress test the political appetite to take some of these actions so that you can address those divergences before you get into a crisis. And so that's why our report gets into some of those recommendations about actually developing joint strategies and developing economic exercises that pressure test some of these. The second strategic concept is the one of bound engagement, and this one's a little bit more nuanced. So it's basically it's the idea that the United States, when it's developing and deploying coercive economic measures, it should do so in a way where it's bound by international and domestic legal norms, rules and norms, excuse me. And we want to be kind of careful in terms of how we present this, because what we're not saying or not trying to imply is like that the United States should do good things, therefore we will inspire good behavior by adversary nations or inspire China through our example to, do the right thing. We don't think that's the case. More so, it's that we have an interest as a nation in a stable global order. We have an interest in geopolitical stability. We want to have predictability in the global trading and economic system. And so the best way to achieve that is to try to make our actions on the coercive economic front predictable to the extent possible by doing it through rules and norms. And so then there's the question about what rules and norms are we talking about? With Representative Bera, we talked about the WTO, pros and cons there. Obviously, it's an important tool, but ultimately an insufficient one to get at the full range of activities that we want to. There's questions about U.S. domestic authorities. We've seen a lot of action on tariffs, robust debate in the United States about whether those were appropriate or not. But the point is kind of that they were within the bounds of our rule of law system, and that's an important distinction to keep in mind. And then clearly we're going to need to think up some new rules and authorities. The EU anti-coercion instrument is a good one to look at. It's also a really good example of why we need to be careful about deploying economic tools, because if you look at some of the motivation for that EU instrument, a lot of it is kind of in response to US actions in the past. So just a good illustration of the complexity of trying to do this and the importance of doing it with allies so we're not tripping over each other's feet.
Yeah, no, very, very much so. And there are a number of audience questions that are sort of along those lines of coordination issues, but also divergent sort of views both in Asia and Europe. More general. So I'm going to throw a couple of couple of those in, combine them. One particularly from Nami, who asks about whether the U.S. should leverage in a more meaningful way the EU's Global Gateway infrastructure program that aims to basically be providing an alternative to the Belt and Road. That I would add this is, and should the U.S. be doing more as a unified response? Obviously, this is sort of coming out of coordination at the G7 and efforts, I guess, also that Japan and others have been doing in this space. But do you think on this sort of development funding, development finance, I guess tied in as well onto the debt side, is there more the U.S. could and should be doing to, piggyback lead and be coordinated, or is this something where it's okay that the U.S. is doing things that are in parallel?
It's a good question. And, I think the most important thing is that the U.S. get out there and have its economic agencies engage internationally and show, kind of the benefits of, engaging with the U.S. on these sorts of deals, right? We're going to provide them on a commercially beneficial basis. We're not going to, take over your port in a year or two. And so there is value in having a very proactive economic engagement that is to the benefit of both the U.S. and the partner country. Obviously, I think if you can align it with EU or other partner countries, all the better, right? In terms of just kind of having that broad-based parallel effort. But if it's generally kind of aligned and they're kind of going along the same principles, that's not the worst thing either. I think the idea is generally to make sure there's information sharing and coordination, even if it's not perfect alignment between the programs.
I think, yeah, I would agree full on. And to some extent, to the extent there's a possibility the U.S. and allies can have areas of particular area of focus that are complementary, but dive in sort of more detail. One of the challenges as someone working in sort of development and project finance at times, that occasionally people complain of, well, I can't find any projects to invest in. And some of it is just, whether it's government or especially private sector, and one of the challenges is identifying, well, how do you bridge some of those gaps and reformulate more projects to be investable, so it's not just the same money chasing the exact same projects. And that's where I think some of the changes that have been done over the last few years, allowing equity investment, reducing tied aid, a whole variety of those things are steps in the direction. And I think we'd like to see more in that way, as well as sort of, and the like. Another question that's sort of come up, there's a few questions that are relating to, I think, the risk of Chinese retaliation, right? We already addressed that issue of Chinese export controls. We know there's been an interesting dynamic of, even though China has had and used these off-book measures for years, they are also illegally setting up a number of measures and countermeasures. There's an interesting Chinese legal question that's maybe a topic for another event. But Isaac asked a question, given all the competition and innovation bills in Congress, USICA, of which the CHIPS Act is part, the Eagle Act, et cetera, do you envision increased Chinese pressure on U.S. companies if more legislation is passed? I mean, how would the two of you sort of respond to that risk?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I think the risk is present regardless, frankly. And I think it also is dependent upon which pieces of the legislation that you're talking about. I think every country has a legitimate interest in trying to promote its own R&D and investment and that sort of thing. And that's what a lot of these acts are trying to do. Like, for example, when you look at USICA in its current form, obviously there's the subsidies piece, which is kind of its own beast. But a lot of that is really just kind of the US needing to catch up in terms of making critical investments in research and development. That shouldn't be particularly controversial. Although obviously if some of it is all framed in the competition in the context of competition with China, one might see a reaction. Perhaps you would expect more direct reactions to legislation like CHIPS Act, which, we had Deputy Secretary of Commerce Don Graves on last month, and he clearly said that CHIPS Act is not about China. But I think for a lot of legislators, it is about China, right? It's about rebalancing the playing field, making sure that U.S. domestic production of chips is competitive on a global basis, and making sure that the U.S. retains a lead. That might cause a reaction. And particularly when you look at some of the stuff that's directed at forced labor, I mean, that is clearly touching a button with China, and we should expect to see continued retaliation. We're already seeing pressure on Western companies who are even just trying to comply with the U.S. legal requirements. And so that is a delicate balance that U.S. policymakers are going to have to continue to navigate.
Sure. And especially, and an issue also for U.S. allies in the like, in their own versions. I mean, and one of the issues, maybe just to pick up on something that you've said has come out in the report, one of the other challenges and important parts of coordinating with allies is trying to make sure that there aren't measures that the U.S. takes as part of strengthening things at home that undermine the ability of other allies to also sort of do the same. I'm thinking, for example, some of the things in the obviously stalled Build Back Better Act, but around sort of EV subsidies and what that means for integrated, autos. And so just, I think that what we're talking about in the report is just saying, well, plan these things out, have more ongoing discussion, and sort of figure out what can be done. I know we're running up on time. I want to squeeze in one or two more questions. Emily Jin, question came in about whether there were any surprises in the gaming, in the gaming exercise. I guess I would reframe it and say, were there any things that surprised you out of the results? Or any things that are sort of particularly, I mean, the question also asks, are there gaps in current policy? I think some of that, the specific recommendations report addressed, but were there things that surprised you, either because they were even greater than expected or the reverse? And if you have any comments on the other questions, please feel free to go ahead.
Right. I'm trying to think of the instances where I was surprised. And without actually disclosing too much minutia about the scenario, which you guys can, people in the audience can check out in our report. I think one surprise was the people who played all those different teams, the country teams. So it would be the United States and China as a default, but in the Asia scenario, we had Taiwan, for example. We also just had regional teams, like just a team that represented European interests. All of the players were very aware of the integrated nature of the American and Chinese economies, and everyone was very conversant which meant I think there was surprisingly a baseline of, especially from the US and the People's Republic of China teams, there was a understanding of not escalating to the most extreme forms or going with the most extreme forms of policies, at least not initially. That was a little bit surprising to me because as we ran the scenarios, I thought, it will just be all out retaliatory cycles. So that could just be like we had a lot of experts who have been reading about tracking these issues for many, many years, perhaps. But I feel like experts are very that could be proxies to policymakers who are also very cognizant of the dynamic at play here. But that was very interesting. There was a lot of discussions about we have to potentially escalate, but let's not go with the nuclear option, at least at the beginning.
Yeah. No, I felt the same in seeing some of the dynamics. Hopefully not just a case that experts have had more experience in trying to run ideas up the ladder and sort of going for that incremental aspect. But I think that's something that could be teased out in different ways from more extensive and more tailored sort of gaming simulations. And as a result, out of some of these sort of bilateral, mini-lateral sort of groupings that are taking place on a range of issues, whether it's relating to supply chain issues. Final question, and this is for Emily Kilcrease. I'm going to pick up, Mara wants to pick up on something related to related to something Representative Bera mentioned, which is about sort of tariffs as part of a toolkit. Do you have any thoughts about how the U.S. should respond and think about tariffs if it's another country being, facing coercive policy? Is that something, would the U.S. ever think about collectively raising tariffs, say, against China, or is this something that's more likely to be? Is this more likely to be something that is done individually?
Yeah,
only if it affects the U.S.
Yeah, it's a hard question, right? Because tariffs are essentially trying to divert trade from one place to another, and you'd have to be quite careful about kind of the upstream and downstream impacts of that, and make sure that they were pretty precisely targeted and calibrated to, not cause more damage to the U.S. economy, even if they're done with a noble purpose. So you would need to be quite careful about that. I'm not sure that that's the right answer if you have other tools at your disposal. For example, direct aid to the impacted consumers or businesses or countries. That could be a much more direct, less trade distortive and less disruptive way to kind of blunt the economic impact, lessen the efficacy of the coercive action, and trying to address it that way rather than trying to tinker too much with the global trading system.
I think that makes sense. And I think the case we have going on right now that I'm sure we'll all be thinking a lot more about around Lithuania is an interesting case in point, where, of course, it started out really affecting Lithuania, but it's now affecting U.S. and German input items that might use those products. So I guess there's an element with the highly integrated supply chains. You could very quickly have something that impacts the U.S. Directly. That still doesn't mean that tariffs are the best way to address it. And we know of some of the experience of trying to play, sort of extend and change the terms around steel, of how difficult it sort of can be. But I think an interesting question ahead, particularly in that case where we're starting to see some countries provide sort of, especially Taiwan, provide some alternate support with sort of development funds and the like, but also this question mark about how the rhetorical support moves on. So that'll definitely be something to watch and something to apply some of the lessons from this report. With this, I know we've gone a little bit past our hour, so I want to thank all of you, sort of the both of you for participating in this discussion, to thank all of you for posing questions and sticking with us. Please feel free to send us follow-up questions after the fact. Thank the CNAS staff for all you've done to sort of promote this event and keep it running. And also thank again Representative Bera for kicking us off with those good discussions. Have a great day.